If you think survival is about stocking canned beans and bottled water, you're already dead. An electromagnetic pulse doesn't care about your preparedness level or your good intentions. It cares about one thing: destroying every single piece of technology that makes modern civilization possible. And when that happens, when the lights go out and never come back on, you'll discover that survival isn't a hobby. It's a brutal test that most people will fail in the first 72 hours. So if you're serious about understanding what comes after an EMP strike, if you want to know the truth that no government official will tell you, then subscribe now, because this information could be the difference between life and death when the grid collapses. An EMP strike is not science fiction. It's a weapon that has been tested, studied, and weaponized by multiple nations, including the United States, Russia, China, and North Korea. The principle is simple but devastating. A nuclear weapon detonated at high altitude, somewhere between 25 to 300 miles above the Earth's surface, creates an electromagnetic pulse that radiates outward at the speed of light. This pulse doesn't kill people directly. It kills the infrastructure that keeps people alive. Within microseconds, the surge of electromagnetic energy induces massive voltage spikes in anything with electrical circuits or metal conductors. Power grids explode, transformers melt, communication networks vanish, vehicles with electronic fuel injection systems stop working instantly, hospitals lose power, water treatment plants shut down, and the entire backbone of civilization crumbles before anyone even understands what happened. The Congressional EMP Commission estimated that a single high-altitude nuclear detonation over the central United States could affect the entire continental region. That's over 330 million people suddenly thrown back into pre-industrial conditions. But here's what makes it worse. We're not prepared like our ancestors were. They knew how to farm without tractors, preserve food without refrigeration, and survive without electricity because that was their reality. We've forgotten those skills. We've become completely dependent on a system so fragile that one coordinated attack could end it permanently. The Commission's findings were clear. Within 1 year of a catastrophic EMP event, up to 90% of the American population could perish from starvation, disease, and societal collapse. Let that sink in. 9 out of 10 people you know would be dead within 12 months. The first few seconds after an EMP strike would be confusing. Lights flicker and die. Your phone goes black and never turns back on. Your car, if it's modern with electronic systems, just stops. You're sitting in traffic and suddenly every vehicle around you becomes a 2-ton paperweight. People would get out, confused, trying to restart engines that will never fire again. Some would assume it's a localized power outage. Others might think it's a cyber attack. Very few would immediately understand that every piece of electronics within hundreds or thousands of miles just became useless junk. There's no explosion, no mushroom cloud visible on the horizon if the detonation happened high enough. Just silence. The hum of civilization goes quiet. Within the first hour, panic begins. Cell towers are dead. Landlines are dead. Internet is gone. There's no way to call for help. No way to find out what happened. No way to reach loved ones. Emergency services can't communicate with each other. Police radios don't work. Fire departments can't coordinate responses. Hospitals running on backup generators might have a few hours of power, maybe a day if they're lucky. But once those generators run out of fuel or their electronic controls fail, it's over. Patients on life support die. Surgical procedures can't be completed. Medications requiring refrigeration spoil. The entire medical infrastructure collapses while doctors and nurses stand helpless, watching people die from treatable conditions. By hour 6, the water stops flowing. Municipal water systems rely on electric pumps to maintain pressure. When the power dies, so does your water supply. You might have whatever is left in the pipes and your water heater, maybe a few gallons if you're quick to fill your bathtub, but that's it. No showers, no flushing toilets, no drinking water coming from your tap. And here's the nightmare. Most people only keep a few days of water at home, if that. The average person needs about 1 gallon per day just for drinking, more if you account for cooking and basic hygiene. Do you have 30 gallons stored right now? 60? Because that's what you'd need for one person for 1 month, and the water isn't coming back. Within the first 24 hours, grocery stores are stripped bare. People don't need to understand what an EMP is to know that they need food and water. The hoarding begins immediately. Shelves empty in hours. Fights break out over the last packages of bottled water. Store employees abandon their posts because what's the point of working when money means nothing and there's no way to even process transactions? Cash might work for a brief window, but only if store owners decide to honor it. And why would they, when they know resupply trucks aren't coming? The entire supply chain depends on trucks. Trucks depend on fuel. Fuel depends on electric pumps at refineries and gas stations. And all of that is gone. Every grocery store in America operates on a just-in-time inventory system. They stock only what they expect to sell in the next few days. There are no warehouses full of backup supplies. When the trucks stop, the food stops, and it stops permanently. By day 3, the dying begins in earnest. People with diabetes run out of insulin. Heart patients can't get their medications. Asthmatics suffocate without inhalers. The elderly and infirm who depend on regular medical care and prescriptions start failing. Dehydration kills the unprepared. And then there's the violence. When people realize that help isn't coming, that the government can't save them, that they're truly on their own, the fragile social contract shatters. Looting turns into home invasions. Home invasions turn into murders. Gangs form. Desperate people do desperate things. The rule of law evaporates because there's no way to enforce it. Police can't respond to calls they can't receive. Prisons lose power, and depending on the security systems, inmates might escape. Even if they don't, guards have families too. They're not staying at their posts when their own children are starving at home. Let's talk about something most people don't consider: sanitation. Modern sewage systems require electricity to operate. Pumping stations, treatment plants, all of it stops. Toilets in high-rise buildings won't flush. Even in homes, once the water pressure is gone, you can't flush waste. Human waste accumulates. Disease spreads. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery. These aren't medieval problems. They're what happens when sanitation infrastructure fails. During the Syrian civil war, when infrastructure collapsed in certain areas, cholera outbreaks killed thousands. That was with international aid organizations trying to help. After an EMP, there is no international aid. There are no relief convoys. Every developed nation would be dealing with the same catastrophe simultaneously if the attack was coordinated. And even if it wasn't, no country has the capacity to rebuild another nation's entire electrical grid while managing their own crisis. The first winter after an EMP strike would be a mass extinction event. Heating systems don't work. Natural gas lines might still have pressure initially, but without electricity, most modern furnaces can't ignite. Wood stoves and fireplaces become priceless. But how much firewood do you have stockpiled? Can you cut and process more when every chainsaw with an electric starter is dead and you're competing with thousands of desperate neighbors for the same dwindling trees? People will burn furniture, books, whatever combustible material they can find, but eventually it runs out. Hypothermia kills quickly. Frostbite leads to amputations without medical care, and those amputations lead to infections, and those infections lead to death. Entire cities in northern climates would become graveyards. Food production would collapse entirely. Farms today are mechanized operations. Tractors, combines, irrigation systems all require fuel and electronics. Even if a farmer had older, purely mechanical equipment, they'd need diesel to run it, and there's no fuel distribution system. Fertilizers and pesticides are manufactured in chemical plants that can't operate. Seeds are genetically modified and controlled by corporations. They're not saved and replanted the way heirloom varieties used to be. Most people don't know how to grow food, and even those who do would struggle because topsoil has been depleted by industrial agriculture, requiring constant chemical inputs just to produce crops. Grocery store produce comes from California, Florida, and increasingly from other countries. When transportation stops, so does the food supply. You can't feed 330 million people with backyard gardens, especially when most of those people live in cities with no access to arable land. Starvation is a slow, agonizing death. Your body begins consuming itself. First goes the fat, then muscle tissue, then organs. Your immune system weakens. You become susceptible to diseases that would normally be minor. A simple infection becomes fatal. Your cognitive function deteriorates. You make poor decisions. You take stupid risks. And through it all, you watch your family suffer the same fate, unable to help them, unable to save them, because there is no food and no way to get food. The strong will prey on the weak. Those with weapons and the will to use them will take from those who can't defend themselves. Morality becomes a luxury no one can afford. But let's say you prepared. You have food stored, water filtration, a defendable location, weapons, and the skills to use them. You're in the top 1% of survivors. Now you face a different problem: other people. Word spreads that you have supplies. Maybe you were careless. Maybe someone saw you with working equipment. Maybe you tried to help a neighbor and they betrayed you. Now you're a target. A group of armed men, former police or military maybe, people who know tactics and have combat experience, they decide they want what you have. Can you defend against that? Do you have enough ammunition? Enough people you trust? Or do you end up executed in your own home while raiders take everything you spent years accumulating? The psychological toll would be devastating. Imagine watching civilization collapse in real time. Imagine hearing screams from neighboring houses and knowing there's nothing you can do. Imagine the guilt of turning away starving children because feeding them means your own family dies. Imagine killing someone for a can of food and having to live with that for the rest of your life, however long that might be. Post-traumatic stress disorder would be universal among survivors. Depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, these aren't weaknesses, they're natural human responses to unnatural horror. And there are no therapists, no medications, no support systems. You either process the trauma and keep moving, or you give up and die. Communication and information would become priceless. Without internet, phones, or radio, how do you know what's happening beyond your immediate area? Rumors spread. Misinformation becomes rampant. Maybe the government survived in hardened bunkers and is working on restoration, or maybe they're gone too. You wouldn't know. Old-fashioned word of mouth and written messages would be the only option. But who do you trust? In a world where deception could mean the difference between eating and starving, everyone becomes suspicious. Communities might form, small groups banding together for mutual protection and resource sharing. But those communities would be fragile, prone to internal conflict and external threats. Transportation would revert to pre-industrial methods: horses, bicycles, walking. A journey that took 2 hours by car now takes 2 days on foot, if you can make it safely through hostile territory. Roads would become dangerous corridors where ambushes wait. Bridges and choke points become kill zones controlled by whoever has the firepower to hold them. Trade would happen, barter systems emerging naturally, but the exchange rates would be brutal. A chicken might cost you a week's worth of labor. A rifle could be worth more than a house used to be. Precious metals, gold and silver, might have some value, but you can't eat gold. Food, water, medicine, ammunition, these would be the real currency. Disease would rampage unchecked. Without antibiotics, a simple cut could turn gangrenous and kill you. Childhood diseases that were nearly eradicated would return. Measles, mumps, whooping cough, they'd kill children by the thousands. Tuberculosis would spread in crowded refugee camps. Malaria and other vector-borne illnesses would expand their range as pest control measures vanish. The mortality rate would be medieval. Women would die in childbirth at rates not seen in developed nations for over a century. Infant mortality would skyrocket. The average lifespan would plummet to maybe 40 or 50 years, and that's if you're lucky enough to survive the first year. Let's address something critical: nuclear power plants. The United States has nearly 100 operating nuclear reactors. When the grid fails, these reactors need backup power to cool the fuel rods and prevent meltdown. They have diesel generators for exactly this scenario, but those generators were designed for temporary outages, days or weeks at most, not permanent grid failure. Once the diesel runs out, and it will run out because there's no fuel delivery system, the cooling fails. Fukushima showed us what happens next. Meltdowns, radiation releases, entire regions becoming uninhabitable. An EMP strike could trigger multiple Fukushimas across the country, creating dead zones that last for generations. Survivors would have to flee these areas, further concentrating desperate populations into shrinking safe zones. intensifying competition for resources. The long-term environmental consequences would be severe. Without industrial activity, you might think nature would recover, and in some ways, it would. But in others, it would get worse. Chemical plants and refineries would leak toxic materials into groundwater. Oil pipelines would rupture. Hazardous waste sites would go unmonitored and uncontained. Rivers and lakes would become polluted from untreated sewage and industrial runoff. The air might get cleaner in cities, but localized environmental disasters would be common. And then there's the issue of knowledge preservation. How much of human knowledge is stored digitally? Medical textbooks, engineering manuals, agricultural guides, all of it locked in devices that no longer work. The few physical books that remain would become treasures, assuming they don't get burned for heat first. Rebuilding would take generations, if it happened at all. The Industrial Revolution required vast amounts of easily accessible coal and oil. We've already extracted most of the easy stuff. What remains requires advanced technology to reach. Without that technology, we can't get to the resources needed to rebuild the technology. It's a catch-22. We might be stuck in a permanent pre-industrial state. Future historians, if they exist, would look back at our era as a brief golden age of technological achievement that ended abruptly and couldn't be replicated. Children born after the EMP would grow up in a world that sounds like fantasy when you describe the before times. Airplanes, computers, smartphones. These would be myths, stories told around fires, relics occasionally found but never understood. So what do? How do you actually survive this scenario? First, understand that preparation is necessary but not sufficient. You need food storage, at least a year's worth per person, stored properly to prevent spoilage. You need water sources, multiple methods of purification, because you will run out of stored water eventually. You need shelter that can be heated and defended. You need medical supplies and the knowledge to use them, because a first aid kit is useless if you don't know how to treat a gunshot wound or set a broken bone. You need weapons and ammunition, but more importantly, you need the mindset to use them when necessary. Hesitation kills. You need community, but choose carefully. One person can't survive alone long term. You need people you trust absolutely, people with complementary skills. A doctor, a mechanic, a farmer, someone with military experience. But every person you bring into your group is a mouth to feed and a potential security risk. Vet them thoroughly. Establish rules and consequences before the crisis, because trying to create social structure in the middle of chaos doesn't work. You need to be willing to make hard decisions, including turning away people you care about if their inclusion threatens the survival of the group. You need skills. Learn to garden, to preserve food, to hunt and trap, to purify water, to render first aid, to defend yourself. Learn to fix things, because nothing is disposable anymore. Learn to make things, because you can't just buy replacements. These skills take years to develop, and you need to practice them now, not when your life depends on them. Reading about something is not the same as doing it under stress with limited resources. You need to accept that the person you are now might not survive. The moral frameworks that work in civilization don't work in collapse. You'll face choices that have no good options. You'll do things you never thought yourself capable of. You'll lose people you love. You'll fail repeatedly, and you have to keep going anyway because the alternative is giving up and dying. Survival is not noble or heroic. It's brutal, exhausting, and often meaningless. But it's the only option you have. And if you want to go deeper, you'll find in the pinned comment some guides and documents that can take your preparedness to the next level. Check them out when you're ready. The truth is, most people won't survive an EMP strike. They'll die in the first weeks from dehydration, starvation, violence, or disease. Of those who make it past the initial die-off, most won't survive the first year. The world would be fundamentally changed, reduced to a fraction of its current population, scattered into isolated communities struggling to maintain the barest existence. Everything you know, everything you rely on, everything you take for granted would be gone. And it could happen tomorrow. One missile, one detonation, and the world ends not with a bang but with silence. So the question isn't whether you believe this could happen. The question is what you're doing about it right now, today, because when the lights go out, it's too late to prepare. Don't just watch this and move on. Take action. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to understand what's coming, comment with your own preparations and strategies, and subscribe because the information we share here could save your life when everything else fails. The grid is fragile, the threat is real, and your time to prepare is running out.